Imagine spending decades in prison and your shot at freedom doesn't hinge on new evidence, but on grammar? Well, that's not a hypothetical. It's exactly what just happened in a major Supreme Court case. And we are going to break down how the tense of a single verb changed absolutely everything. So, to really get this, let's just start with the stakes. 325 years. No, that's not a typo. That was the actual prison sentence handed down to each of the men in this case. You gotta ask yourself, how on earth is a sentence like that even possible? And that exact question is what launched this whole incredible legal journey. Okay, here's our game plan. We'll start with a wild law that created those sentences in the first place. Then we'll see how Congress tried to fix it, but accidentally created a really weird legal puzzle. That puzzle is what leads us to the big fight over grammar, the Supreme Court's decision, and, most importantly, why a tiny detail like this actually matters a whole lot. All right, let's dive into part 1, sentences of over 300 years. We've got to get to the root of this, which is a practice called sentence stacking that was causing prison terms to spiral completely out of control. So let's meet the men at the center of this: Tony Hewitt, Corey Duffy, and Jarvis Ross. Back in 2009, they were convicted of bank robbery and a bunch of firearm charges. But here's the kicker, the part that you really have to pay attention to. Under this specific law, they were all considered first-time offenders, and yet each one got a sentence of over 3 centuries. So how did the math get so insane? Well, it all came down to how this old law stacked sentences. Your first firearm charge got you a mandatory 5 years, but a second charge, even if it was part of the very same crime, minutes later, wasn't another 5. It was a whopping 25 extra years tacked right on top, and another 25 for the third, and so on. It was like a runaway train. The numbers just exploded. You know, you can tell a law has gone off the rails when the judges who are forced to apply it are publicly calling it out. One federal judge said this practice was unconscionable and shockingly harsh. He literally said he felt like he was being forced to give first-time offenders a life sentence. That's a huge deal. Okay, so all this criticism was building, and that brings us to part 2, Congress's first step. Lawmakers, seeing this mess, finally decided they had to do something about it. So in 2018, something pretty rare happened. A huge bipartisan majority in Congress passed the First Step Act, and a key part of that bill was aimed directly at killing the stacking problem. The new rule was simple, logical. That massive 25-year penalty would only kick in if you had a prior conviction from a totally separate case. It made sense. No more stacking charges from a single crime spree. But you know, fixing a law for the future is one thing. What about all the people already in prison because of the old law? And that's our next section, where we get into what I'm calling the retroactivity riddle. Okay, so here's where it gets weird. The new law said it applies to anyone if a sentence has not been imposed by the date the law passed. Seems straightforward, right? But what about this bizarre edge case? What if you were sentenced before the new law, but then for some completely different reason, a court throws out your sentence after the new law is on the books? Does that count? Are you now a person who has not been sentenced? And that is the exact weird legal vortex that Hewitt, Duffy, and Ross fell into. Just look at this timeline. They get sentenced to life in prison back in 2009. The new, fairer law passes in 2018. Then their old sentences get wiped out, vacated, because of a totally separate legal issue. So when they come back to court to be resentenced, everyone's scratching their heads. Are they stuck with the old, brutal law, or do they get the benefit of the new one? And this, right here, is where the whole thing comes down to a fight over high school grammar. I'm not kidding. With literally hundreds of years of prison time hanging in the balance, the entire case boiled down to the tense of a verb. So you had 2 totally different ways of looking at this. The government's argument was all about historical fact. Look, a judge imposed a sentence on these guys in 2009. That's a thing that happened. Case closed. But the petitioners argued for legal validity. They said, look, once a sentence is vacated, it's legally gone. It's a ghost. It's as if it never existed. So right now, in the present, they don't have a sentence. And it all comes back to these 5 little words in the law: has not been imposed. The Supreme Court's entire job was to figure out what in the world Congress meant when they chose that very specific phrasing. So, time for a very quick grammar lesson, I promise. That phrase, has not been imposed, is what's called the present perfect tense. And this tense is special. it doesn't just talk about the past. It's used to describe a past event that still matters right now. It describes a past that, touches the present. And Justice Jackson, writing for the majority, came up with the perfect analogy for this. She said, imagine an athlete wins a gold medal, but later gets stripped of it for doping. Now, can she go around saying a medal has been awarded to her? Can she call herself a champion? No way. The award was revoked. It doesn't exist anymore. Justice Jackson's point was that a vacated sentence is exactly the same. The historical event doesn't matter, only its current legal reality. So, with all that on the table, what was the court's final word? How did they end up solving this crazy grammatical riddle? Well, they sided with the petitioners. In a majority ruling, the Supreme Court reversed the lower court's decision. They said that because the men's original sentences had been vacated, they were, in fact, eligible to be sentenced under the new, more lenient First Step Act. The court's whole reasoning rested on this powerful legal idea called vacature. See, when a court vacates a judgment, it's not just saying it was wrong. It's treating it as if it never existed in the first place. The legal slate is literally wiped clean. So from a legal perspective, these men were standing in court as people for whom a valid sentence had not yet been imposed. But of course, this wasn't unanimous. The dissenting justices stuck to that historical fact argument. They basically said, come on, you can't just pretend a sentence wasn't imposed back in 2009. For them, wiping it out later didn't erase the past event. It still happened. So let's zoom out. What's the bigger picture here? Why does a super technical ruling on verb tenses actually matter to the rest of us? Well, here are the big takeaways. For one, it makes sure that this specific group of inmates actually gets the benefit of a law Congress passed to create fairer sentences. It also means judges aren't forced to use an old, broken sentencing system that Congress has already thrown in the trash. But maybe the biggest lesson here is just how much the little things matter in the law. A single verb tense can literally be the difference between life in prison and a second chance. It really makes you think, doesn't it? How many other laws out there have these little grammatical tripwires hidden inside them? How many other people's futures are hanging in the balance, not on some grand legal philosophy, but on one single carefully chosen word? This is for entertainment and educational purposes only. This is not legal advice.